Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We've assembled a truly excellent panel of experts to have this conversation about the future of democracy, authoritarianism, and geopolitics in East Asia. Together, they cover a wide range of substantive and regional expertise, and they're also very much focused on regime type and geopolitics in their recent research. Before I begin introducing our panelists, I wanted to thank Kevin O'Brien, the director of the Institute of East Asian Studies, which is the organization that spearheaded this event, as well as Dylan Davis, the associate director of IEAS, Claudia Guy, and Sky Van Valkenburg for putting this event together. This series of events is jointly sponsored by the Institute of East Asian Studies, the Center for Chinese Studies, the Institute of International Studies, which is the entity that I co-direct with Daniel Sargent, and the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office of San Francisco. Daniel Sargent, who again is my co-director of IIS, moderated a related panel yesterday on security opportunities and challenges in the Taiwan Strait. And the kickoff panel for this series took place last week. It was called The Taiwanese Economy in a Period of Transition. All three panels are being recorded and will be made available in the coming weeks on the IEAS YouTube channel. The panel today is motivated by changing global power dynamics, shifts in global governance, and renewed debates about the relative importance of regime type in foreign policy, all of which raise important questions about the role of democracy and authoritarianism in the geopolitics of Asia generally and in East Asia specifically. If the US reemphasizes the global importance of democracy going forward, how is China likely to react? Are other actors like Russia important in understanding these dynamics in East Asia? How will potential US-China tensions over democracy influence other democratic enclaves in the region, including Taiwan and Hong Kong, but also South Korea? Are any tactics or trends related to undermining democracy new, or is it more of the same? Is this some more of what we've all been seeing all along? What are the biggest concerns that we should be discussing regarding the geopolitics of democracy in East Asia? Although I'm not an expert in East Asian politics, the international relations and geopolitics of regime type is a topic that is very much near and dear to my heart, and I'm looking forward to learning from our panelists today. I'll now briefly introduce them and say once again how delighted we are to have you all join us. Each panelist will speak in turn for about 10 or 15 minutes. They'll speak in the order that I introduce them with some prepared remarks, and then we'll move into a more free-flowing roundtable conversation. We will be taking questions from the audience, and we have a good-sized audience with us today. So if you have questions, you can put them in the question and answer box that's available to you in the Zoom webinar format, and I will select some of the questions to the extent that we have time after the prepared remarks. Now turning to introductions of our panelists, Dan Slater is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, where he is also the Weiser Professor of Emerging Democracies and the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. He is a non-resident scholar in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Professor Slater specializes in the politics and history of enduring dictatorships and emerging democracies with a regional focus on Southeast Asia. He's recently written on the role of democracy in US-China relations, as well as on long-term prospects for Chinese democratization, topics that I hope will come up today. Sheena Chestnut Greitens is an associate professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and an affiliate of both the Strauss Center and Clements Center for National Security there. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, an adjunct fellow with a Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University, and a member of the Digital Freedom Forum at the Center for a New American Security. Professor Greitens' research focuses on US national security, East Asia, authoritarian politics, and foreign policy, and has ongoing work on the implications of China's domestic security policies for the rest of the world. She also recently published a fascinating article in International Organization on the likely effects of COVID-related health surveillance by various countries in the region and evolving technologies of state surveillance on democracy and dictatorship. Seva Gunitsky is an associate professor of political science at the University of Toronto. His work examines how international forces like war and globalization shape democracy and domestic reforms. He is one of the leading experts in political science on external or international sources of domestic political reforms, and has also written extensively on the global and regional diffusion of trends relevant to our discussion of regime type, including some recent work on the role of information and disinformation in understanding regime type and related global trends. If you're looking for reading material, I highly recommend the award-winning books by all three authors. My favorites are Professor Slater's Ordering Power, Contentious Politics and Authoritarian Leviathans in Southeast Asia, Professor Greitens' Dictators and Their Secret Police, Coercive Institutions and State Violence, and Professor Gunitsky's Aftershocks, Great Powers and Domestic Reforms in the 20th Century. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Professor Dan Slater.
Well, thanks so much, Susan, and thanks really for the opportunity to join a conversation with such great and really smart company, especially on these geopolitical questions. As a comparativist, it's a topic that I'm needing to get more and more into, the geopolitics of this, and I've been thinking about it a lot more since Biden's election in particular. But let me share some thoughts. So I've actually, before the coup in Myanmar, interrupted my progress on a paper. It interrupted a great many things, of course. But I was working on a paper that I called "Asia is not flat," which is something like Africa is not a country, I suppose, as a way of thinking about things. But what I was trying to do in that essay, and what I'd kind of like to start by doing today, is to critique what I see as two flattenings that tend to occur when we ask these questions about the geopolitics of democracy and authoritarianism in East Asia. And so one kind of flattening is to see everything through the rubric of US-China rivalry. And the other one, relatedly, is to see everything through a competition between democracy and authoritarianism. Naturally, the two are related, but they're not entirely identical. Now, it's clear that democracy, or at least rhetorical support for democracy, is always going to be one goal of U.S. foreign policy among many goals. There's obviously uneven active backing for that goal, but rhetorically, this will always be part of what the U.S. does. And with Biden in the White House, we're seeing it return. But what I would argue is that it's better for us to think about democracy as a goal than to think about it as a club. And I don't think that it's healthy to be sort of rethinking the world right now as basically two monster alliances, one democratic and one authoritarian, for many reasons, but one of which is that I think the past decade has shown abundantly that every democracy in the world has authoritarian potential. And I would argue it's still the case that every authoritarian regime in the world has democratic potential. And so sort of essentializing regime type as the foundation for alliances, I think is sort of counterproductive in a variety of ways. So that's just sort of to kind of set the stage for the comments I want to make. So instead, what I'd like to do is talk about two different kinds of problems that I see at this interface of democracy, authoritarianism, and geopolitics in East Asia today. And so I want to talk about what I see as regime problems and then what I see as empire problems. And I think the two need to be distinguished. They're different kinds of problems. So loosely speaking, regimes are the way that political leaders attempt to govern their own populations. And empires are attempts by political leaders to govern people who are outside of their immediate political control. And so there's, of course, a lot of room for interpretation here. Where does a regime end and an empire start? What kind of governance counts as imperial versus authoritarian? So these are, obviously big questions, but I still think it's a helpful way to proceed. So let me start with what I see as the regime problems in East Asia. So it's been a really, really bad decade for democracy in the wider region, in the sense that just of countries moving further away from democratic ideals and into deeper forms of authoritarianism in many cases. So we could see the regime problems in East Asia taking kind of three forms. So autocratization in already authoritarian regimes, democratic backsliding in democracies that are losing a lot of their democratic substance, and then autocratic stability. So cases that remain authoritarian but are not kind of moving in any kind of democratizing direction. So just to take three especially prominent examples of each from the region to give you a sense of what I have in mind. Over the course of the 2010s, we saw autocratization in China, in Cambodia, and in Thailand. Of course, recent events in Myanmar after its steps forward during the decade of the 2010s is a major shock to the system here, I would say. We've seen democratic backsliding over the last decade in Indonesia, in the Philippines, also in the United States, which is, I think, a critical player and partner and participant in Asian politics. And then we see autocratic stability over the past decade in countries like North Korea, Singapore, and Vietnam. And so this is a lot of cases with regime problems if we care about democracy in East Asia. And so in a world where we have limited resources and we have scarce attentions, I think it's worthwhile to focus on those regimes that have the greatest potential to have their problems spill over into the international context, and also those that are not just authoritarian regimes that, in many cases, in most of Asia, authoritarian regimes actually work quite hard to try to develop their countries, to try to provide some level of responsiveness, and distinguish those kinds of regimes from the more pathological regimes, if you will, those which are essentially captured by certain kinds of power cults, if you will. And on that basis, and from a sort of human rights perspective, as well as a realist perspective of thinking about where spillovers are most likely to happen, I really think that Myanmar and North Korea right now are kind of the two priority cases that we should be thinking about in terms of their regime problems. And the challenge here, in a sense, is that you're not going to get, movement toward better outcomes in places like Myanmar and North Korea, or get moves away from the worst possible outcomes, unless the U.S. and China can work together to some degree. So I think this is a good example of how getting good regime outcomes requires us to move away from a world of a really stark Manichean world of U.S.-China rivalry and nothing else. Obviously, U.S.-China cooperation is critical on other issues as well, from COVID to climate change. So given the range of countries I just mentioned that have regime problems, I think it's clear that if we treat democracy as a club and not just as a goal, then all of these countries I've mentioned get downgraded. They all get sidelined. And that's just not a sensible way to do foreign policy in East Asia. There are simply authoritarian regimes with which we have to deal on a variety of issues. So that's what I want to say about the regime problems in East Asia. Let me get to the what I call the empire problems. And it seems to me that both the United States and China have substantial problems in the region related to questions of empire, if you will. So when we think about China and its periphery, I would encourage us to think about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang as a different category of problem from these problems of authoritarianism and repression, although those certainly exist in these cases. Historically speaking, these are aspects of how empires turn into nations. Multinational empires try to turn themselves into nation states, and in this respect, these create much thornier, much more difficult problems that are not easily thought of through a democracy authoritarianism framework. So China has all of these problems on its periphery, I would say. It's also vital to note that China is a developmental latecomer in East Asia, and it's confronting a region in which it has other countries in the region have just decades-long head starts over China in terms of economic development, technology, investment, and the like. And as a result, it's very, very difficult for China to assume the kind of leading role that people assume it's ready to play in East Asia. Similarly, I think the US also has empire problems, if you will, in East Asia. The US clearly is experiencing declining relative power, declining prestige, and I think maybe most importantly, declining public support for an ongoing leading role for the US in Asia. So the defeat of Donald Trump notwithstanding, I think that the kind of moves he made away from the alliances is going to be a recurring issue for the reliability of any American commitments in the region. So I'd like to kind of conclude with the observation or the provocation, perhaps, to say that while the US and China, I think, are clearly the strongest powers globally today, I think they're both surprisingly weak powers in a regional perspective in the way they operate in the region. I think, honestly, it's more likely in the next decade or two that China could become the most powerful country in the world than to become a truly dominant power in East Asia, given just the multiplicity of players and countries there that have strong interests and are not interested in a pax sinica, if you will. So I think this is all the more reason for us not to survey East Asia from a strictly US-centric or Sino-centric perspective, and to try to at least begin by recognizing the range of important players in the region and the array of vital challenges that we should be trying to address alongside these questions of democracy, authoritarianism, and geopolitics. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful, Dan. Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to go to Professor Sheena Greitens. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation today. What I want to do is, in some ways, to pick up a bit where Dan left off, and I really like this concept of remembering that Asia is not flat. Although now I have sort of some of the more acerbic critiques or rebuttals of Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat, going through my head. But when I look at Asia, I'm going to talk about two trends that I see emerging in the region, one of which is very much in keeping with this idea that Asia is not flat, and that regime issues and geopolitics in Asia are not monolithic. One of those is sort of about the present moment and the effect of the pandemic on regime type. And then the other has more to do with the potential impact of a national security strategy from the Biden administration that has a very, very particular view of the role of democracy in American foreign policy. So first, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the effect that we've seen, or the potential for the pandemic to have longer lasting impact on global trends in democracy and authoritarianism. As Susan's work and Dan's and Seva's and really a lot of people have documented, prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the world had entered a period of democratic backsliding or of autocratization, either re-autocratization or strengthening of autocracy within already authoritarian political systems. And on top of that, we've seen that in some places, the efforts to track this, for example, by the VDEM Institute, have shown that there is some real pandemic-associated backsliding. That's a tricky thing to measure, right? Because it might be that a country had trends toward autocratization or backsliding that predated the pandemic and have, continued during this period for reasons that actually aren't driven by the pandemic itself, but that have nevertheless continued. But there are also ways we know that states of emergency and public health crises can introduce particularly by empowering executives to do things under emergency orders or emergency conditions, can contribute to autocratization. And so we've seen a number of those trends play out both globally as well as in the Asia Pacific. So the Philippines, a place that Dan mentioned a moment ago, that has experienced some democratic backsliding and some problems with democracy over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, has experienced some further challenges specifically related to the use of police power and human rights abuses specific to lockdowns and pandemic enforcement. And that's just sort of one model. But the other big factor is the potential use of health surveillance, and whether or not we're introducing forms of surveillance in response to a crisis that might well outlast the pandemic and the public health emergency itself. And we know that in some cases, surveillance measures, once introduced in the name of security, can be very difficult to roll back, whether that's in the UK in response to terrorism challenges, the US after 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are some real reasons to be concerned about the long-term effects of surveillance. But again, what's actually really interesting here is that Asia is not flat. So I'm going to go back to Dan's line and borrow it once more. And I say that because we have in Asia a model coming from China that the Chinese authorities have pretty actively promoted, that really fuses public health with public security and policing, but does so in ways that very specifically draw on the sort of the Leninist and the grassroots organizations that China's party state has developed to maintain social control and to mobilize populations over the past several decades of PRC history. But nevertheless, China has been pretty clear rhetorically and diplomatically that it sees its model of pandemic control as something that it has to offer the world. What exactly it means by that could be a number of different things. I don't know that there's a coherent, sort of formulaic model that it's trying to transplant, but it's been pretty clear that it views itself as having lessons to teach. On the other hand, though, we have places like Taiwan and South Korea, which have employed health surveillance, right? Their performance in the pandemic has not been because they completely rejected or refused to use any kind of health surveillance. But what's been quite interesting about that is that these are two countries that have their own history of having experienced fairly intensive surveillance during a period of authoritarian rule during the Cold War. In both cases, fairly long-lasting authoritarian periods, one party-led in Taiwan, one military in South Korea. But places that also then subsequently in their democratic history had a public health emergency and had a period after that emergency subsided. I'm thinking of SARS in Taiwan and MERS in South Korea, where they had a moment to stop and say, okay, how would we want to deal with a public health emergency? What kind of surveillance powers would we give the government? And also based on, knowing what we know from our own history about the role that surveillance played and the overreach and the human rights abuses it can be associated with, what checks and constraints do we want to put on surveillance? And so what happened is that you got a sort of use of health surveillance that was circumscribed by law. It was subject to judicial review, legislative debate. So all of the normal democratic checks and balances that exist had an opportunity to sort of come to bear, rather than surveillance being passed under emergency conditions, subject only to the particular preferences of an executive or of the executive branch. The point is not that that's been perfect, right? That either of those countries have arrived at a perfect solution or a model that's suitable to all democracies, right? I mean, even Taiwan and South Korea, there is some real variation in how those laws were applied and the way that democratic constraints operated on surveillance. But the point is that there was a somewhat, I think, democracy protective effect in the way that those countries arrived at their use of health surveillance, and therefore we've seen much more limited impact of the pandemic on the core institutions of democracy and civil liberties themselves. So I think that's really important to remember, that there's a lot of variation in responses to the pandemic and the relationship of the pandemic to the quality of democracy across the Asia Pacific. Let me turn then briefly to my second point, which has to do with what I think the other big trend or big factor that we're seeing introduced into the geopolitics of the region, which has to do with the Biden administration's national security strategy. And the fact that it really emphasizes democracy, not just as a value to be defended or a goal to be pursued, but also as a strategic asset to be leveraged. And there's a document that was co-written by about pretty much almost the entire Democratic half of this bipartisan report. There's a report that was written by the Alliance for Securing Democracies. And if you look at the Democratic half of the list of authors on that, almost all of them are now in the administration. And it was released about a month before the election. And I think the concept is actually a pretty good guide to some of the things that we're now seeing being embedded into the national security strategy. And that is to treat democracy as part of what they call an offset strategy. Which is essentially trying to find the belief that democracies are somewhat vulnerable in competition with authoritarian regimes, and therefore democracies need to find an offset, a way to leverage particular advantages to offset democratic vulnerabilities. And I think this is a little bit different. I agree with Dan that there's this tendency to view Asia right now through the lens of US-China rivalry, and also to view it through this prism of democracy versus authoritarianism. I will say I think both the Biden administration and the Trump administration rhetorically did some of that. The Trump administration did characterize Asia as a region that it argued was a geopolitical competition between free and repressive visions of world order. Right, that was their sort of framing of what was happening in the region. And then the Biden administration has emphasize this idea of democratic advantages and democracy as a strategic asset to be employed in the region. So I think this is something that actually has some continuity across administrations. But the idea of democracy as a strategic asset is a little bit different than I think we've seen previous administrations treat the role of democracy in American foreign policy. So one of the key questions I think this raises, and again, I think this really gets directly to Dan's point about democracy as a goal and an aspiration, rather than a sort of a club of defined members, has to do with the other emphasis in the Biden administration's national security rhetoric, which is a lot of talk about the importance of alliances and partners, again, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. And immediately you run into the challenge, if you're a policymaker in DC working on these two goals, the challenge of doing both at once is that, again, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity within the Indo-Pacific. And the United States has to work with, I would say, about 3 different categories of allies and partners. One is allies and partners who are just not particularly democratic at all. Maybe Vietnam, maybe Thailand. A second category is those who are weak or highly flawed democracies. I would, say both the Philippines and probably India fall into that category. This is not an exhaustive list, just giving examples of important partnerships in each of these categories. And then you also have countries for whom, even though they might be consolidated democracies, there's a third group for whom, even though they are themselves democratic, democracy may not be the principle around which they orient every foreign policy decision in the way that the Biden administration is now articulating and framing its foreign policy. And I would even put allies like South Korea in that category, where there are some really, South Korea is a pretty vibrant, robust democracy, some concerns about democratic backsliding that have appeared in democracy journals recently notwithstanding, it's still pretty robust in terms of its level of democracy. But it's also pretty clear that there are cases where the United States would want democracy and human rights to play a more central role, for example, in UN resolutions on North Korean human rights, where South Korea has some other priority that they place ahead of that goal. And so even if there are countries in the region that are important allies and partners that share democratic values, the prioritization may differ. And then I would say even also within that category of democratic partners who just view the implications for strategy a bit differently, are places that are reluctant to sign on to the idea that all democratic backsliding or much of the democratic backsliding or autocratization that we're seeing is a result of Chinese influence. I think there's a pretty robust debate among scholars about the extent to which China's great power status and its international influence interact with domestic drivers of either backsliding or autocracy, autocratic stability, autocratization in countries in the Indo-Pacific and globally. But since we're focusing on the region today, there may be countries that look at Asia, look at the Indo-Pacific, want to pursue democracy promotion, but just see the causes and drivers of challenges to democracy very differently than the United States. And so I think that really does place the United States in a position where they're going to have to disaggregate approaches to the Asia Pacific, even though there's this overarching strategic concept about democracy and democratic values. Implementation is going to require a much more nuanced and a much more disaggregated approach to a region that is just fundamentally heterogeneous in a way that doesn't match the sort of a more monolithic framework. Finally, I'll say that I think the final challenge the strategy might have is that it can interact in some particular ways with a Chinese party state that itself has taken a more ideological turn under Xi Jinping, that is emphasizing the role of ideology and party history and party control, particularly strongly right now in the run-up to next year, to 2022. But that risks, I think, maybe generating a bit of what has been called an ideological security dilemma, where each side is doing things that it sees as system defensive or defensive of its own political system, but that can be interpreted as potentially offensive by the other side. And I think we've seen some of that rhetoric coming from both the United States and China in the past couple of years. And so I think there's a potential for these framings to interact in ways that really harden the rivalry and undercut this ability to implement a more disaggregated and nuanced strategy. I will stop there and turn it over to Seva, and then look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now we are moving on to Seva Gunitsky, who's going to take our focus even broader and discuss things really at the global and international system level, which is why I invited him.
That's why I'm here. Thank you very much, Susan, first of all, for inviting me today. And thank you to everybody for attending. I'm very happy to share panel space with Dan and Sheena, two people whose work I've admired and assigned in my courses, and two people who are, as you can see from their bios and their words, are far more qualified to speak about Asian politics and the specifics of their domestic regimes. My presence here is made possible mainly due to Susan's generosity, and also in a secondary way by my historical interest in how great power competition has shaped the evolution of democracy in the past. So let me begin by talking a bit about the key geopolitical dynamic in the region. Thank you, Sky. I promise I only have a few slides, and that is the evolving rivalry between China and the US. Keeping in mind Dan's warning that not everything can or should be subsumed under this rivalry, I do think it's worth clarifying the terms of this still very contentious debate, which you might have seen. There's an ongoing debate about how to label this and whether we should even call it a Cold War. And of course, the label is indeed fraught with all sorts of baggage. And the problem is compounded by the fact that people use the term in different ways. So let me just unpack a bit what we mean when we talk about a Cold War. I've seen a lot of pieces invoking the metaphor, other pieces rejecting the comparison. I think neither position is helpful because it hides a duality that's at the heart of this analogy. And that is the two ways of thinking about the Cold War, first as an international system, and second as a geopolitical rivalry. People who hate this comparison often mean it in the first sense, as an international system. And it's true, if we are talking about the Cold War as an international system, there is no comparison to what's happening today. Relatively rigid global bipolarity was a strange, a historically unique condition, and unlikely to come back. But as a world-endangering geopolitical rivalry, the situation is similar in some respects, even if it's different in others. Probably, personally speaking, probably the most worrying difference compared to the first Cold War is that we have still arms proliferation, but very little arms control. So we're about to run another version of the Cold War, but without all the treaties. And this is where comparing today to the Cold War is actually helpful in the sense that it reminds us of the dangers. But of course, even taking the second definition, there are a lot of geopolitical rivalries. Should we call all of them Cold Wars? I don't think so. Ultimately, the Cold War metaphor remains important and will be important because so many policymakers are already thinking about China in those terms. And again, that's not unambiguously good or bad. It's bad if it exacerbates the confrontation. It's good if it encourages policymakers to be more cautious about escalation. I'm still agnostic on this point. And just to be provocative for a second, it is possible that a Cold War with China might be good for domestic US politics by returning US politics to a measure of foreign policy bipartisan consensus that was present during the Cold War and very much lacking in the post-Cold War era. And I think one plausible reason for extreme polarization among the elites, well, there are many reasons, but one is the lack of an external enemy. So it is ironic and sort of troubling to consider that a Cold War with China may help preserve American democracy. Again, I raise this as a provocation, not as an opinion. Now, what would something like a Cold War actually happen? Well, setting aside the issues with the historical framing, there are a number of critiques of this analogy, and generally they can be broken up into three reasons why we will not have a Cold War with China. So again, I'm going to set aside the issues with the rhetorical framing, what it means when we embrace the Cold War analogy. The critiques fall into three camps. And the first one has already been mentioned by the previous two speakers, is is there really an ideological struggle in the same sense? China is not offering its version of crusading democracy promotion the way the US has. At least that's the argument, that it's not seeking to convert fellow travelers. It's not a universalizing ideology. And the ideology argument to me, frankly, seems to be the weakest. The conflict is already ideological in the sense that the two countries offer two competing visions of modernity, and in the sense that policymakers on both sides are convinced that their system is superior. And I expect it will get more ideological as the conflict sharpens up. And I expect any Chinese reticence at regime promotion will fade away. I'll come back to this point in a moment. The second category we see here is that, look, globalization and extensive economic ties will moderate conflict. And again, the situation is very different than the first Cold War, where the two superpowers basically had their own blocks that did not interact with each other very much. Certainly not the case today. And with economics, the argument is more compelling than the ideological one, but we know economic ties are not reversible. And the specter of people like Norman Angell, all those people who predicted that war was obsolete, hangs over these explanations, even accepting the fact that, of course, today's economy, with its complex supply chains and everything, is very different than in 1914. Third, we no longer have a fairly rigid bipolar system with two opposing alliances. And so purely on a geopolitical level, the world lacks the setup for the kind of stark competition that we saw in the Cold War. And this is what I meant earlier when talking about the Cold War as a system. And the third argument to me is the strongest for the reasons I mentioned. Bipolarity is historically unusual. So globalization and multipolarity both act as moderating factors, and both of those make the historical comparison problematic. But in the end, the question is whether ideological differences and domestic incentives pushing for a Cold War in both countries will be strong enough to overcome these moderating influences of globalization and multipolarity. And I suspect that they will. I suspect that ideology and domestic politics will override those moderating effects, and we will see increased great power competition between China and the US. So let's accept that we have some version of great power competition without necessarily committing to a loaded term like a Cold War. What does this tension mean for democracy in the region and domestic regimes more generally? It's not clear to me really what the US-China rivalry means for regime types in the region, partly for the complicating reasons that Dan and Sheena already mentioned. One thing we can do is look at the last time this happened. The last time there was this sort of competition, Asia was a contested battleground, ideologically speaking, where the US and the USSR competed over clients and influence. And both of these were utopian in their aspirations. Both of these countries were universalist in their goals. Both offered a vision of development that explicitly transcended national boundaries. Will we see something similar today? And of course, that's been one consistent critique, is China is simply not engaged in that kind of regime promotion, that it lacks the desire to do so, that it's focused on technocratic assistance, not ideological crusades. And I wrote in my book a few years ago now that China might be the first non-proselytizing great power since the Dutch Golden Age. That was a few years ago. Now I'm increasingly not so sure. It's fairly clear that Chinese officials are not just a bunch of technocrats, they are guided by ideology. And even if they're guided by ideology instrumentally, that is, they don't really believe it, they're just doing it to please the leader, the effects are the same. A country that grows more materially powerful while also becoming more outright ideological will soon find reasons to wage crusades abroad. It happened to the US, it happened to the USSR, it happened even to fascist states like Germany. You know, you don't think of Nazism as a natural candidate for regime promotion, but Nazi Germany, for example, cultivated all kinds of philo-fascist organizations and supported fellow travelers all over the world, in South America, the Middle East, South Europe. So any regime can be for export if it offers an appealing mixture of power and ideas. And I think it's true in the short run that the CCP is interested in stability and survival above all, not regime promotion, maybe some prestige, image protection, less about regime promotion. But as I said, rising powers, especially when they feel sufficiently stable at home, will find interests that they did not know they had. Now, worries about Chinese influence are also happening in the global context of general worry about democracy. And we hear a lot of talk about an autocratic cascade, an autocratic wave of which Asia is a part. And so if we are experiencing an autocratic wave globally, how will this affect Asian politics? Well, when we look at the history of regime change in a global perspective over the 20th century, when we see autocratic waves or autocratic cascades, we really see them unfolding in two different ways. One path is the sudden rise of non-democratic great powers. By sudden rise, I mean a hegemonic shock or hegemonic shift in which a non-democratic great power rapidly increases its share of relative power. We see this with Germany's resurgence after 1933, and most clearly in Russia's emergence as a superpower after 1945. So that's one path. The second path, when we look at sort of the ups and downs of democracy, is what I would call democratic overstretch. On next slide, please. Or the rollback from past democratic waves. And these waves produce a kind of stock market bubble in which there's a huge rise in democratic pressures, but these pressures are passing, they're ephemeral. So you have countries adopting democratic institutions that have very little chance of sustaining them because there are powerful international pressures at the moment, but those pressures don't last. And we see this in Europe in the 1920s. We see this in Latin America in the late 40s. We see it in Africa and elsewhere in the mid 90s. Autocratic cascades that are created by democratic overreach and rollback, and that is the democratic overstretch path. So what are we seeing today? I think it's a combination of the two. I think both historical pathways of autocratic diffusion can be glimpsed in the international system since 1991. First, the democratic overstretch story, the decline of democracy from its, what we might call an artificially high point following the Soviet collapse. And secondly, the autocratic ascent story, which is really the story that we're talking about today, the relative decline of the US, the decline of American unipolarity, and the rise of a new great power challenger that embodies a different and in some ways attractive regime model of state capitalism. And the question is whether that regime as embodied by China now represents a credible rival to the liberal democratic model in the same way that monarchy, fascism, and communism all did in the past. On that, I'm not so clear. But I can say one thing with a high degree of certainty. The 20th century suggests that the future of democracy depends to a large extent on the changing structure of hegemonic power, and that a sudden decline in American power would pose a much greater threat to global democracy than a gradual Chinese ascent. So for that reason and others, I don't see the rise of China as inaugurating an autocratic wave in the region anytime soon. I wanted to say a bit about social media and disinformation, but in the interest of time, let me maybe save that for Q&A if anybody's interested, and say a word about Russia. And I really don't have much to say about Russia, because it's not really doing much in the region in terms of the things that we're interested in talking about today. Russian politics is essentially entered its late Brezhnev stage, but without the stabilizing social torpor that characterized Brezhnev-era Soviet society. That is a hugely dangerous combination for the regime. So stability is the overriding priority for the regime. And I would add stability in the face of what it sees as continuing regime pressure from the West, with Russia turning inward as a result. So while Russia doesn't do regime change per se, it is obsessed with regime change. And that is a strong word, but I do think it's very much on the minds of Russian policymakers and especially foreign policy officials. And here, I mean, of course, regime change by the West. What they see is encroachment by the West and by Europe and by NGOs with the purpose of undermining Russia. And I believe, and I think hopefully not too controversially, that this was the primary motivation for Russian involvement in the 2016 election, as they saw Hillary Clinton as somebody who would aggressively pursue regime change in the region through sponsoring Maidan-like revolts and revolutions. So Russian mentality on regime promotion has been largely defensive and ad hoc, and I think this extends very much to Asia as well, where it's essentially trying to navigate a relationship with China as it becomes increasingly unmoored from the West. So in this region, Moscow's interests are subordinated to strengthening the relationship with China for the foreseeable future. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much to all of our panelists. And Seva, don't put away your remarks about the social media quite yet, because I think there's still some interest in covering that topic, and I know I have a question. that I've written down about that. What I wanted to do first is just open it up to the panel and invite the panelists to respond to one another. I know there was a provocation during the last remarks that might prove something that we do want to talk about. So, Dan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Seva's what he called a provocation, which I think is, something that I've actually argued pretty explicitly recently, which is to say that, at a time when U.S. politics is so polarized and there's very little that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree upon, they do seem to agree on the China threat. And I do think that the risk that this flattening will take place, not just from kind of a sort of intellectual laziness, but because, Biden is very, very interested in unifying the country, and trying to find areas of commonality across the partisan divide. And if that can happen, maybe at times unhelpfully raising the stakes of U.S.-China conflict, I do very much worry about that. And I would just also, say that to the question of the Cold War, another reason to move beyond the Cold War analogy in the U.S.-China relationship is I think it's actually worse than that, in the sense that I see a lot more echoes in terms of Japan's rise and U.S. response to Japan's rise. And in particular, and this hasn't come up, but I think we'd be remiss not to mention the issue of racism and the issue of anti-Asian racism, because the risks of U.S. conflict with China are, some percent. But what we know is that, people of Asian descent in the United States right now walk around every day in the shadow of much greater, fear of being targeted. And I think that, one thing we learned about, in the U.S.-Japan conflict, John Dower's book, War Without Mercy, showed this, that when the U.S. gets into conflict with Asian countries, that the racial implications can be very, very worrisome. So I think that as we think about the Cold War isn't necessarily the worst case scenario, especially if you're of Asian descent living in the United States. So I think, this is something we should be on our radar screen as well.
Thank you, Dan. Sheena, did you want to follow up with anything from the other panelists?
Yeah, sure. I think there are a lot of important points that Dan just raised very quickly. I will say that I think the difference in the racial dimension of the Cold War is important, and potentially hardens or exacerbates this sense of otherness that adds a different dimension to a rivalry that already seems to be trending in an ideological dimension. And so putting race and ethnic difference on top of ideology is potentially just really concerning. So I guess I would share the concern, and I'm glad that Dan raised that. I did want to ask Seva a question about the idea that the moment that we're living in has more to do with an autocratic rise on China's part than democratic overstretch, I think was the term that you used on the slide. Because in particular, we're seeing some arguments right now that the United States has overstretched, that it has expanded beyond where it should have been. And there are calls for restraint as an American grand strategy. So I guess I wanted to ask you, how do you distinguish some of the potential for autocratization or an autocratic wave or wave of democratic backsliding due to democratic overstretch versus sort of a democratic retrenchment, if in fact that's what we see the United States engage in, or are concerns about that the United States will do that, or predictions that the United States might pursue that as a strategy just completely overstated and not empirically logically grounded. I guess I was just trying to think about, U.S. strategy and national security strategy in the present moment, and whether or not what the boundary between restraint and overstretch and retrenchment and how these things relate to each other. So it was more just a question about what that framework and what your point means for American foreign policy today.
So before you respond, I'm just noticing that in the Q&A, we're getting a fair number of questions just about how we as political scientists and international relations scholars think about rising and declining power and relative power and what it means. There's a question about China's shrinking population and what that means for the future of its global power. And there's also a question about whether and why the U.S. is declining in power and what we mean when we say that. So maybe I think I want to give you a chance to respond to the questions you got, but I also, if you could add that briefly, I think that would be helpful to a number of people in the audience.
Yeah, sure. And Sheena, thank you very much for your question. So yeah, it's a good question because conceptually they're hard to separate, the overstretch of democratic institutions and the rise of an alternative. And when I talk about overstretch, I don't mean just the US. I mean the general momentum for democracy that we saw at the end of history in the mid 90s, in the early 90s, that there was so much sort of incentives, especially external incentives to adopt democracy, that countries adopted these institutions that really we could probably guess were not going to be successful. Now, on the US side, Iraq and Afghanistan are sort of the epitome of democratic overstretch in the sense of regime promotion. And I think, if you look at how the US is, the role of the US in the promotion of democracy or the spread of democracy, to me, it has not been through direct promotion, which has often been hypocritical and clumsy and backfired. It's often acted more responsibly as a side worth joining. That has been the major draw for other countries to try to get on the good side of the US and also try to become more like their regime. So as far as US foreign policy of restraint, I don't imagine more restraint will lead to some kind of democratic retrenchment, purely because when America does try to muscularly and aggressively promote regime change, it usually backfires. And that, to add to Dan's point, I don't know what shape the Cold War with China will take, but I do know that it will be a lot dumber for a couple of reasons. One is we will be relitigating the same debates that people did in the 30s and the 40s. I see it already. And there will be a racist undertone that was simply not present the first time. So for those reasons, I'm dreading the discourse around these issues. I'll stop there and let others talk.
So let's see. I think I have a number of questions, and I'm just going to. There's a bunch in the chat, in the Q&A. I'll remind our audience members that if you do have a question, there's a Q&A button, and you can type it there. We have a bunch sitting there that I'll get to. But I was very struck by a parallel in some of your remarks that came to me, which is tied to a lot of this conversation, and also ties into some of the questions about surveillance and potentially information. Which I think are two parts of this regime type conversation that I think are really interesting. Dan, I think you mentioned in your remarks that there are authoritarian governments that are distinguished by being more accountable and citizen serving than other authoritarian governments. And I think that that these responsive authoritarians are sort of interesting in this conversation because they're distinguished from some of the sort of less responsive and potentially more coercive, corrupt, and potentially human rights abusing, that sort of thing, sorts of governments. How do we think about, in my mind, I'm developing this comparison between a policy that really emphasizes, I'll call it popular sovereignty or responsiveness to citizens, which can cut across democracy and authoritarianism, and a real emphasis on security, state security, public security. I know other people have made this comparison in recent years. But if we think about this problem going forward, and we think about the state security and surveillance issue, and then we add to it this question of geopolitical stability and rivalry, I'm very curious how we think about how well governments do internationally that are very much focused on being responsive to their citizenry, be they authoritarian or democratic, versus governments that are very much focused on high levels of state security, and perhaps they might call it public security, that might bring in aspects of high levels of state surveillance, touching on some of the other comments. So I know that's not a question I sent to you earlier, but I do think it's a really fascinating part of this discussion to think about the geopolitical implications of these different ways of organizing democracy and authoritarianism that are a little bit less flat, to use some of Dan's language, and that Sheena picked up on in part. I will. Does anyone want to respond to this question, or did I catch you off guard by asking one off?
I mean, I think it's a great set of questions, Susan. I mean, I'm really glad both Sheena and Seva are here to deal with the technology question. They've both written really, I think, eloquently about it. And I think in some ways that's where I think is kind of we're in this new frontier in some ways. And I think that from a historical perspective, I really see, China's liabilities in its immediate neighborhood, which I think have only gotten compounded during the Xi Jinping era. But on the other hand, some of these technologies really, where China is, been quite impressive in terms of leapfrogging and being, a major setter of standards and exporter of these technologies. And so, again, this is something where I think the paradox, we think of countries that they project power in a way that, like concentric circles, and they can project more power over countries closest to them, and then their power dissipates over space. And I don't think it necessarily works that way with China right now. And I think, again, with the U.S. as well, just these liabilities in East Asia itself. That East Asia, I think, is a distinctly I don't know if multipolar is the right term, but certainly a space where you have, a lot of players with a lot of resources and a lot of national pride and a lot of very stable government, which gives them the capacity, kind of to Susan's point, the capacity to project themselves internationally in a more strategic way, not needing to, drum up, false crises for, internal regime maintenance or anything like that. So I really think there's something different about international power projection happening now, which I think Seva, Sheena are better positioned to answer than I am. And I would love to learn more about how this works, to be honest.
Seva, did you want to get in on this and cover anything?
Well, I was hoping Sheena would, because I assigned her a piece on surveillance in my course and enjoyed it very much. So if there's any insights you'd like to share from that piece, I'm sure the audience would very much appreciate it. Basically, that's me saying you answer.
Yeah, I'm happy, I guess, to take this question about technology and surveillance. And I do think these are a really interesting set of questions. So I'm going to maybe try to answer Adam Casey's question in the chat about how worried should we be about China as a perfect informational state and why. And in the process, maybe also give at least a partial answer to some of the points that Susan raised, although I agree that they're fantastic and would take me probably an entire paper or hour to think through systematically. First of all, I think there are some ways in which China's clearly pursuing surveillance technology and technologies that can assist in social control in a really aggressive way. That said, I think some of our popular portrayals of them aren't particularly nuanced, in the sense that China itself, if you look at how China assesses the use of technology, they're pretty concerned that they've invested a lot of money in stuff that doesn't work very well. In the sense that, and let me put a slightly more academic sort of explanation under that statement. Part of surveillance's power is not just in the data that you collect, but then being able to put different types of data together and actually use them in governance, deploy them, get that information from one part of the system that collects the information to the people who can actually use it to implement policies on the ground that are conducive to regime stability and social control. And it's that translation step, that data integration and deployment step that where I think the Chinese political system, right, we see the data collection investments because they're the most visible, they're the easiest to track. We don't see the back end and how well data gets integrated and then deployed in governance. And China's actually been really concerned that this push for digital governance has resulted in what the premier called information islands. Data that gets collected and technology that has been invested in that can't talk to each other. And so in a piece recently that came out with a Chinese co-author, we talk about this effort to solve problems of information islands, largely by investing in these back-end data integration platforms. But the reality is there's still a lot of politics involved, right? And so I think this is what Adam Casey's question is getting at, that like these are still fundamentally political issues. People don't want to share information, not just because there's some tech glitch, but because information is a form of bureaucratic power. And it also makes people vulnerable and accountable. And so if actors want to evade those conditions, then they're resistant to sharing information. So I think there's a little bit of a tendency sometimes for the journalism that tries to raise concerns about the surveillance state that China is constructing to actually do some of the marketing for the tech companies for them. And it's just really hard to strike the right balance on that. Between raising concern, talking about the risks that these systems engender, but sort of, not overhyping them. I would say that I'm still pretty concerned about the development of some of these tools for two reasons. One is that inherent in processes of democratic accountability, and yes, there's some accountability in various authoritarian systems, but I would say on the use of surveillance in particular, the Chinese political system has a pretty high tolerance for false positives in a way that a lot of democratic systems don't. And if you just think about the attention being brought to bear on basically false positives and targeting of people wrongly by the police in the United States, right? We're in the middle of a huge national conversation about that. It's not clear. In fact, I would say it's fairly clear that the Chinese political system has a much higher tolerance for what I would describe as a false positive. And the use of algorithms, like you have to kind of decide, do you want a false positive or false negatives? And what rate are you willing to trade off these two types of errors? This is a point Jen Pan makes in her fantastic book about surveillance and the welfare state. So one concern I have is just that these systems, as they're deployed and designed by companies or autocratic political systems, have that higher tolerance for these false positives. The second has to do with the point Dan raised about export, where these systems are now going to a huge variety of political systems around the world without necessarily putting in the guardrails. And the guardrails are not always technical. They're often legal and regulatory. And that requires a functioning democracy to put, in many cases, or just a really well-intentioned self-regulating authority to put those guardrails in. And these technologies actually don't seem to work very well for the public goods that they're intended to deliver, which is safety and crime control. So they're marketed as delivering an upside that they don't deliver, and we're not putting in some of the guardrails to protect against the downside. So for that reason, I still find them concerning, both in terms of China itself, but also in terms of their global export. Sorry, that was a long answer. That's my best take on a couple of those issues.
It's fascinating. And I think, just adding to that, and I think that other panelists actually want to get in on this too. I've thought a lot about it, about just if there's a public perception that people are being watched, what that does to democracy, right? So if we think about surveillance introduced in a more democratic context, it doesn't actually have to be good surveillance if people think that it is, for it to have a chilling effect on political expression, for example, and all that. And I think that these dynamics are very interesting. So be curious for the word to get out about what you just told us amongst broader populations. Seva, I think you wanted to respond as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Susan, you began by mentioning how the autocracy democracy distinction is unhelpful in some ways, in some cases, and I think this is one case where that might be the case, because we see techniques of mass surveillance adopted by governments across all regime types, as you've mentioned. In the U.S., it takes a different form. There's a collection and sharing of customer data that's sometimes in partnership with law enforcement, but it's a ubiquitous feature of life and socially accepted feature of life in democratic states. Not to mention, of course, U.S. government surveillance programs of its own citizens, like the X-Keyscore program. So when it comes to surveillance, a clear line between autocratic and democratic states is increasingly difficult to draw. And this is especially the case because when you look at traditional tools of digital autocracy, like blocking software, they rely on products created and sold by Western democracies. So when a state like Syria suppresses online dissent, it uses Western companies. This is just simply what happens. So the techniques of digital autocracy are increasingly indistinguishable from techniques inside democracies themselves. And this is part of a greater sort of online convergence in techniques within democracies and autocracies. So it's that's a worrying development as well for me.
Dan, I think you wanted to follow up as well.
Yeah, I think what Seva said just dovetails really nicely with what I was going to say, which is that I think there's also this question of, so when, a leading technological power in the world exports its technologies, like what do we make of it? And I've sort of been thinking, like, in terms of this, if China is, been at the cutting edge of these surveillance technologies for domestic reasons, it's not surprising that they would be exporting them if strictly for economic reasons. So if we think about, I kind of often think of the parallel of American arms sales around the world, right? So American, arms producers sell enormous amounts of, weapons around the world. Of course, Russia too, Seva, and this is actually one area where Russia really does matter in the region right now, which is Russia's relationship with Myanmar, in terms of the arms relationship. But it's not clear to me, or I think it's a question, at least, to what degree, when we see these exports of technology, that we perceive it and kind of frame it as some kind of grand strategic design, as opposed to that these are, actors trying to sell technology. They're trying to make profit. And I do think this is one of these areas where I think, again, race can play into it. And I think there is a way in which perceptions of, Asian people, Asian powers can be this sort of hive mind kind of prejudices that people have, that I think we might too often see more cohesion, more, sneakiness or design in something being done by an Asian power, to be perfectly frank, than we would when it's not. So I think people need to check, I think these are things that need to be empirically verified, right? To what extent we see this as something that's, again, trying to foster, in Seva's, when Seva thinks about like regime diffusion, right? To what degree this is something about emulation, something about diffusion of an authoritarian tactic, as opposed to something that's kind of happening in the Chinese private economy to a large degree.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just add one final thought to that. I think, I've done some work on some of the statistical correlates of who ends up with Chinese surveillance platforms. And one of the things that's really interesting is whether or not you have an overall global strategic partnership with the PRC, so with the government, does matter. It makes you more likely to adopt the technology. But there's also sort of regional diffusion effects. So once the technology gets introduced in a place like Ecuador or Kenya, it actually tends to spread within in both cases, the continent. And in many cases, what you're seeing is that these are mayors or regional officials who say, well, we just have to get crime under control. We have a really high homicide rate. We've got to attract investment. We need, tourism numbers to go back up, et cetera, et cetera. And these technologies are being marketed by the tech companies as a solution to crime control. The problem is they don't appear to work very well. And so I actually, the US has been, I think, pretty heavy-handed. And this is a case where the US has been very flat in its approach, right? It's all about China and Chinese tech being bad. Whereas I think it would have been much more effective to go to some of these places and say, look, I get it. You've got a governance issue. You've got a development issue. Guess what? This actually isn't going to solve your problem. And then to talk much more about that and about the interests of these other countries, rather than viewing this all through the US-China lens. I really hope US diplomacy gets much more granular and much more nuanced, because I think that would be much more effective.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I'm loving this conversation. I have so many questions that I want to ask, but I do want to think about turning to one of the questions that I had proposed to you all beforehand, which is we're coming up on the anniversary of the Hong Kong protests, the pro-democracy in part Hong Kong protests. If you look at this panel title, a lot of people will think about Hong Kong and what's going on there in terms of democracy and authoritarianism in the region. And so in terms of the response to this protest movement in Hong Kong, and then the Chinese response to the protest movement, I know some of you have written on this. Sheena, I know you've written on this recently. But what do you think are the longer lasting implications of responses by other regional democracies to what was happening in Hong Kong? There's a few questions about this in the Q&A as well. Sheena, I'm going to put you on the spot because you have written on this. So I think you probably can go, and then maybe others can flag me if they want to get in on this.
Yeah, sure. I really see what's happening in Hong Kong as sort of an extension of Xi Jinping's reconceptualization of either national or state security. So this picks up on some of the earlier discussion about how different countries approach the challenge of state security. And I think Xi Jinping has taken a particular approach to this, which is really to see the external environment and internal political security for the CCP as very deeply connected and a bit darker. And so in contrast to the rest of the world, where we often see China as sort of approaching this high point in its influence in global politics, when Chinese sources write about this, and when you look at what Xi Jinping says, that's actually paired with this sense that and as we get closer to this goal of national rejuvenation, the challenges and the risks actually get bigger and the resistance grows. It's this kind of dialectical pairing of proximity to the goal and the resistance or the effort required to achieve the goal. And so I actually see that very much as having propelled, and obviously this is not just Xi Jinping, it's kind of a product of a lot of other factors in the Chinese political system. But I do think his personal worldview matters because the system has been more personalized itself. It's become a more personalized autocracy under Xi Jinping's leadership. But, I see that as some of what's happening in Hong Kong as this sense of we have to make sure that international forces don't interfere with CCP goals for Hong Kong. And CCP's goals were to have a national security law a while back that could never get through the legislature. So that was the obstacle. So now we're going to pass a national security law specific to the Hong Kong special autonomous region that makes the changes we need to the electoral system to apply this national security framework. So it's kind of a confluence of these long-standing goals that the CCP has, which I agree with Dan. This is really about kind of the periphery of a multinational empire and areas where that transition, the boundary of the PRC was contested, right? And this is sort of unfinished business from the CCP's rise to power and its sort of returning China to its previous status. It's a very restorationist kind of argument and language that is used in a lot of the rhetoric. But it's a blending of that with this recognition that the international environment can destabilize China's efforts, either fully internally or in these contested peripheral areas. And so I actually see a lot of what's happened in Hong Kong as kind of that operating at that point of intersection. So it suggests to me that the CCP is not going to reverse course on Hong Kong. This is what it said it wanted to do a while back. Yes, it's a new way of getting to that objective. And it's willing to be more proactive and accept higher costs to get to that goal. But that's actually what the CCP has been preparing itself internally to do, because the whole framework for the last 5 or 8 years has been sort of consolidating people behind this idea that the closer you get to the goal, the higher the resistance is. And so I think that doesn't actually, I'm unfortunately pretty skeptical, because I think a lot of the sanctions and international pressure has been priced in to the current course of action. And I think that makes it very, very difficult for the international community to try to reverse some of the trends we're seeing in Hong Kong. Does that answer your question, Susan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Dan is going to chime in as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I unmuted, so I signaled that, didn't I? Yeah, well, and I think I agree, and this is really why I tried to make this distinction at the outset from these kind of their regime problems and their empire problems. And this is not just something where a place is becoming more authoritarian, right? This is one of these cases where this is the inheritance of an incredibly difficult situation, right? That this is, a very, very rich, self-confident, territory, which has just a completely different, economic and political system than the mainland. And there's no sense of revolutionary legitimacy that the CCP brings, like it can claim in the mainland. It's this very, very difficult situation. And I think precisely to Sheena's point, I think what we see is that, that what Xi Jinping has tried to do is basically look at governance challenges, problems of, high levels of protest, high levels of corruption, like all these very real governance challenges that were happening in the mainland when he took power, and basically try to resolve them through a lot of force and a lot of personalization of power, right? Which can work up to a point when you command a ruling party that is totally unchallenged, and there's no kind of different colonial history. There's nothing like that over the population. But when you project that same kind of control, coercion sort of thing to a periphery where it's not just Hong Kong, it's Taiwan, and at the limit, I would say Xinjiang as well, that in all of these peripheral areas, the problems are getting worse. So I think it's putting too positive of a gloss on it to say like, well, sure, as we get closer to our goal, we'll meet more resistance, right? It's actually, I think it's much, much worse for China along its periphery right now. And so it's just really important, I think, to keep in mind as one thinks about these very real questions of, Chinese influence and technological leadership and the like, that they truly are global. I don't want to say feet of clay, but there are these are problems are not getting better, and coercion is not going to solve them. And so these are very, very difficult, kind of insuperable, problems in a way. But because they speak to these questions of what's the nation and the idea of, the resolution of the China-Taiwan conflict, China-Hong Kong, these are not things where external pressure can, be possibly efficacious in the same way as, say, lean on North Korea a little bit, lean on Myanmar a little bit, like make sure there are sanctions for certain kinds of activities, try to move these irresponsible regimes in a slightly more responsible direction. Right? It is just simply not that kind of problem. And like, it's hard to see it going in a better way anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, just to be 100% clear, I was trying to channel how I think China views this to explain what we're seeing in the current course of action. But I would agree with Dan. I think it's very, very likely to be pretty counterproductive on both a global and a peripheral scale. But I also take Chinese sources pretty seriously when they say they think policy in Xinjiang is working. I can vehemently disagree about the metric for success there, but I think the potential for long-term blowback is immense for the reasons that Dan just outlined. But I think we also need to grapple pretty squarely with the thinking in the Chinese political system that led to that approach in the first place, so that we can predict where there's that side of the policy equation is going.
I'm going to shift gears slightly and spin a little bit on a question that Kevin O'Brien asked in the Q&A, and is connected to something that actually came up in the panel that we had yesterday, which is this idea about the degree to which a focus on democracy by the U.S. or by other actors in the region is going to gum up the works in dealing with other global problems that are pressing, like climate change. And I know some of you have written things related to this, but I wanted to ask the panelists how we should be thinking about these tensions between the need for cooperation globally in some areas and a desire to focus on democracy and potentially support citizen-driven movements in some contexts, right? Is this going to be problematic going forward? Should the U.S. just stop talking about democracy? And I have a related question that I want to follow up with if we have time, but I'll throw that out there for now.
I could say just one very brief thing. I mean, I guess I'm not trained as a diplomat, clearly, but I was just sort of stunned at the Alaska summit, and this interaction between U.S. and Chinese officials, where I would just think that when you're a new administration and you're starting a conversation, you would start by saying, here are things we agree on. Like, here are common challenges. Like, these are the things that we need to try to, work collectively toward. And then you work your way up to the hard stuff. But it seemed to just immediately be here are all the things that we just are fundamentally at odds about, such that it just seemed like the possibility for working together on a range of important issues seemed to just kind of blow up on entry or something like that. So there's no way that the democracy question is going to not be a big part of the rhetoric, but I do think there are smoother and less smooth ways of talking about it in ways that undermine or don't undermine the potential for cooperation in other areas. So I think Kevin's point on linkage is really important here, but that might be more about approach, right, or almost style, I think, as opposed to whether it's going to be absent or it's going to be on the agenda clearly.
Does anyone else want to chime in on this? Go ahead, Sheena.
Just really quickly, I think, the key question is exactly how much linkage the Chinese side is going to try to put on certain issues and how much linkage the United States side is going to try to have. We actually saw some early sort of rhetorical test balloons maybe prior to Anchorage, like, hey, if you want progress on climate change, you should back off on Xinjiang. And the Biden administration's signaling was, yeah, no thanks. We'll talk about climate change when that makes sense for the United States, but we're not gonna link those issues. That actually probably in a number of places would also be an advantage for the U.S. I actually think there are some advantages on both sides to disaggregating issues and not linking them, because then you can sort of stick to the values principles where that's going to be important to do so, but still try to solve some problems. It's just not clear to me that's going to be sustained on both sides, given the intensity of some of the rhetoric. I will say I didn't think the Anchorage. What was surprising to me about Anchorage was less that those things were said, because China's been saying some of these things in its human rights reports on the US for years. It was that they were said publicly at the beginning at such senior a level. So, I think, again, we're seeing a real intensification of rhetoric. The question is whether that linkage is going to carry through to sort of more closed door and working level meetings, where often it hasn't, and people have still been able to focus on one issue to make progress. But it's a really important question to watch in the next year or two.
Seva wanted to get into.
Oh, yeah, just a very quick comment to add on. There are some places in some countries where Western assistance is actually counterproductive, where it should be avoided in some cases, like Russia. Navalny, his issues that in order to be a viable political force in Russia, he could not be seen as too pro-West, and he could not be seen as too aligned with Western forces. And of course, now he needs the West. Support is ambivalent, partly for that reason. I think there are larger reasons. So I think one, simple thing the US can do, maybe it's not so simple, is to shift the focus away from a tendentious term like democracy to decent governance or just good enough governance. And that'll be a lot easier to get people on board with.
I have one final question. I apologize in advance to all of the people who posed questions. We got so many, and I tried to work in the ones that I could to our conversation. The thing that I wanted to end with is a question about the future. So we've been talking about how regime type influences geopolitics, how geopolitics influences regime type, how domestic politics influences whether regime type is part of geopolitics. But I wanted to just ask you very quickly, each respond. Do you think that in 10 years or in 20 years or in 30 years, you would be surprised to see more democracy or less democracy in East Asia? Seva, why don't you go first?
Prediction is very hard, especially about the future.
But what would you be more surprised to see? What would shock you?
Yeah, no, I think given the continuing sort of contested nature of the region, it's hard to make predictions that are decisive. I think China will feel increasingly comfortable in promoting its types of institutions, but as the other two panelists have already suggested, it's not necessarily that the closer you are to China, the more you're influenced by it. In fact, in some ways, you're going to be more willing to give pushback if you're closer. So my hope is that the region will sort of keep muddling through and not see any big swings either way, and just keep sort of, I guess, maintaining a degree of regional stability that will eventually, hopefully, lead to some kind of improvements in domestic regimes as well. So the short answer is I have no idea.
Dan, why don't you go ahead next?
I think we'll see more democracy in Asia over the next few decades, but I don't think it will necessarily be in the places that are more democratic now. I think my prediction would be that in places that have higher state capacity now, you're going to see them potentially moving more in a democratic direction for reasons of just solving these problems of growing demands and growing governance challenges. And I think the places that might be more democratic now, but have relatively weak states, we could definitely see more backsliding. So I would think that is one reason why I think we need to be engaging with countries that are governed effectively, even if they're authoritarian, because I think, governing with them, working with them in a constructive way helps keep them hopefully on a track toward eventually liberalizing and not feeling like, someone's trying to force democracy down their throat.
Sheena.
On balance, I would expect to see more democracy or more shifts toward democracy, but I wouldn't expect to see sort of classic, fully consolidated democracy across the board. And I think we'll still continue to see a fair amount of heterogeneity.
And
Wonderful.
I should add, by the way, that one reason is because the past decade has been so bad. So one reason to expect to see is like when the market has bottomed out, you're more likely to see improvement than further decline. So it's partly a statement of where we're at too.
Excellent. But the campanile is starting to ring in the background here at UC Berkeley on campus, and it's time for us to close the panel. Thank you all for participating in a discussion. I could keep talking to you three about this all day. I think it's really wonderful. So let's give you a virtual round of applause, and we'll hope to continue this conversation in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the questions.
Terrific questions. Thank you.
Great questions.